So, and it varies significantly by state within the US, which creates some quite interesting dynamics that we'll see. Please. So before I go into the details of the study, let me just share some of the key conclusions, if I may. First of all, there are very clear links, and we'll see them graphically, we'll see them in the data, between high tobacco taxes, affordability, and illicit trade, which strong enforcement can mitigate. One of the key messages that we're going to see here is the relationship between tobacco taxes, illicit trade, and enforcement. What is very clear in the data is if you increase tobacco taxes without similarly strengthening enforcement, you stimulate illicit trade. And the effects are very stark. The effects can be quite dramatic. The other thing I think we'll say, and I won't spend too much time on the tobacco companies themselves, but I do think the shape of the market is interesting because 20 years ago, when a very substantial piece, the majority of illicit trade was contraband, maybe there wasn't the incentive there for the major tobacco companies to try to clamp down on that, because to some extent it made tobacco more affordable for people. That is, by and large, no longer the case, because with the growth of counterfeit as the largest and fastest growing part of the market, there is diminishing, if any, remaining economic incentive for the tobacco companies to allow any form of illicit trade. So, I think one of the conclusions we'll share here is the incentive that tobacco companies have to work with whomever they can work with to try to limit and reduce illicit trade. So, where because of some of the lobby groups, governments are discouraged or uneasy about working with the tobacco companies, there may be some counterproductive outcomes of that. We can talk a little bit about that. Next, please. Now, when you look at the relationship between tax yield and illicit trade, when you first look at it, and we can share the results, by the way, so if you, feel free to photograph as well, but it's fine. But what you see actually is a big scatter until you start to look at what's really behind that. So by the way, just in case you can't read it, this is tax yield per 1,000 sticks of cigarettes, and this is illicit versus total consumption. What you see, as I said, is a big scatter. However, when you start to look at disposable income, and you break the countries down into higher disposable income and lower disposable income countries, what you see then is an interesting pattern, because what you've got is in each of those two groups of countries, you start to see the correlation between the level of tax and the level of illicit consumption. What it's telling us is, in lower income countries, as you start to move tax up, they are even more sensitive in terms of growth in illicit trade versus some of the wealthier countries of the world. So quite an important correlation we're already starting to see in the data. Next slide, please. Now, when you then start to move to affordability itself, and affordability is defined as the percentage of daily income needed to buy a pack of 20 cigarettes, then actually you see the correlation starting to get even closer in terms of that percentage of disposable income and percentage of illicit. So we're now starting to see some really quite close correlations and a few outliers. Where you see outliers, Latvia, Brazil, those are usually because of supply side issues. So just to take an example, the reason Latvia is highly sensitive is because of the Russian border and the proximity and the porousness of that border and the ability of illicit cigarettes to cross that border. So there are a lot of country-specific issues in here which can cloud the data, but they really do not undermine the overall picture. So let's go to the next one. What's also interesting, and obviously I'm talking mainly about tobacco here, we did think it worth looking at other excisable product categories just to see are we seeing a dynamic which is particularly tobacco-centric, or do you see the same things in other categories? So we looked at unrecorded alcohol, and actually we looked at, again, disposable income versus consumption, and you start to see, again, that pattern, where the higher the duties on alcoholic products, the higher consumption you see unrecorded alcohol. There are also actually some quite interesting and colourful things we found alongside this. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, which we looked at, is one of the largest importer of certain breakfast cereals. Those breakfast cereals happen to be the ideal substrate for making illegal alcohol. Weetabix sales are very high in Saudi Arabia, for example. So there's some quite interesting things you see. But clearly, we're seeing the same dynamic broadly here in unrecorded alcohol we are in tobacco. So that kind of gave us some reassurance that what we're seeing here is a general link between affordability and illicit trade, absent appropriate control. Next slide, please. What we also looked at was what was driving that. Are we seeing here the impact of changes in people's disposable income, or is this really driven by changes in the retail price of cigarettes? And what this chart here, and you can't see the detail, but actually the pattern really tells the story. The orangey bits are the impact of changes in disposable income. So, reflecting the different economic performance of different markets. The blue bits, that's the impact of the increase in the retail price of cigarettes. So what we're seeing here is an impact on affordability, which is really about retail price. It's not about changes in the economic health of different markets. Now, if we're going to go to the next slide, what we'll then see is if you look at what's driving those changes in retail price, and so remember, it's retail price that has the real link to illicit trade. Now, if you look at what this chart's telling us, this is excise duty per pack of 20. This is retail price. So what I'm now seeing is, aside of any other drivers of retail price changes, and there are some in terms of the manufacturers wanting to move the price up, for example, of a pack of cigarettes, because they're out to make money, clearly. But what we're seeing here then is a very, very tightly coupled linkage between the retail price of a pack of cigarettes and the duty component of that. Now that may not be surprising, but what we're now seeing is this kind of series of connections that we're making between the price of a pack of cigarettes, the affordability of that pack of cigarettes, and the growth in illicit trade. And the affordability is driven by excise duty almost entirely. It's by far the principal driver of that. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go into each of these in detail, but what we took 6 countries as examples, and we looked at the link for those countries over a period of time between excise duty and share of illicit trade. And what was quite interesting to see was some very, very tightly coupled linkages. In particular, where there were spikes in excise duty. So, for example, when countries such as Latvia and indeed Romania and much of Central Europe joined the EU, they had to comply with the EU standards for tobacco taxation, which meant dramatic rises in the level of duties. What happened was, concomitant with those rises in duty levels, dramatic spikes in the level of illicit, because they didn't, at the same time, strengthen enforcement. And indeed, a bit like the example we talked about earlier, the porousness of the border, particularly with Russia, but also certain other geographies, into the eastern part of the newly expanded EU, meant that the supply side was very fluid, very volatile, and able to respond to those opportunities. The stories and the others are very similar. Germany went through very significant hikes in excise duties a few years ago. That resulted in a spike in illicit. Government policy then changed. They then put a very slow escalator in place in terms of future rises in excise duty, and illicit came down and became under control. Same issues in Mexico, Malaysia. I won't go into all of them, but you can look at many, many countries around the world, and where you get these sudden spikes in excise duty, and by and large those are done without changes in strengthening of enforcement at the time, you see these spikes in illicit. So there's kind of a strong pattern emerging here. Please. Now the US, and you can't see the detail on that, but I'll explain what it is. The US is a particular example because, as I said, tobacco excise duties are a state issue. So you have widely differing levels of tobacco tax across states. And what you see is, the higher the level of tobacco tax, the larger the cross-state boundary flows are. So this is not about, by and large, illicit or counterfeit, although there's plenty of that as well. This is about contraband flows between states in the US. And it's quite interesting. The outlier up here, and I'll just use it to illustrate the example, that's New York State, New York City. 70% of cigarettes consumed in New York State are imported from the rest of the US because the excise duties are so high, there is virtually no control. So it's very, very easy to ship tobacco products from the rest of the US into New York State. And it's just a good example of just that dynamic working. You give people sufficient financial incentive to do it, and if you don't stop them doing it, the results are very clear. So the US, and I could talk about many of these states, but we don't really have time, but the US is such a good, clear case in point. I think it tells the story very, very clearly. Next, please.
I think actually that's worth remembering if there is any desire in Kenya for giving the counties that we heard about yesterday power to raise their own taxes from excise and to set their own tax rates. Because if they set different tax rates, the same thing will happen.
Yeah, very clear. And it'll happen quite quickly. Because the financial incentives are so strong. Now, these charts are a little complex, but when you read the report, you'll be able to see them clearly. What we did was then try to get under the skin of the enforcement issue a little bit more. And this actually was quite complicated for us. It took us a while to find the right way to look at enforcement on a consistent basis across countries around the world. What we did in the end is we took it's called the World Justice Project. We looked at the World Justice Project, which looks at the rule of law across countries around the world and publishes an overall index of the quality of the rule of law by country. When you dig into that, there are 8 sub-indices of the rule of law index, and 2 of those are the degree of regulatory enforcement and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. And we took a judgment that those were probably the most relevant subcomponents of the rule of law index to apply when looking at this problem. So what we then did was we then grouped the countries into weak, intermediate, and strong from an enforcement point of view. And that was really interesting because until then we hadn't really been able to get at this pattern. But what became very clear was then in terms of illicit trade, if you look here, even just at a simple level, these are the strong enforcement countries. Those bubbles are small, even though taxes by and large are very high. So what that's saying is enforcement is really working. Down here, these are generally the countries where, actually the taxes aren't that high, but enforcement is weak, and there's still enough incentive for illicit trade to grow. So it was a really interesting view. I mean, this was kind of one of our big aha moments when we saw this, was in this data, having used the rule of law index, we could then really see how how countries were actually performing in terms of their level of illicit and illicit growth versus the level of enforcement. You get somewhere like the UK, where I come from, which has got some of the highest tobacco taxes in the world. People are paying £10, $12, $13, for a pack of cigarettes, and yet the enforcement is so strong we have now one of the smallest levels of illicit in the world. By the way, it wasn't always the case. You know, there was a period when tobacco taxes were going up in the UK and illicit was growing very strongly. It's been the enforcement that's made the difference in terms of getting that trade under control. In fact, there used to be, I'll tell you a funny story, there used to be a small pop-up tobacconist stall and confectionery stall right opposite the Houses of Parliament, just across the road from the main entrance to the Houses of Parliament in London. That stall sold counterfeit tobacco. The enforcement was just so weak it was freely available anywhere. It's still quite widely available. It's still more than 10% of the UK market, but it's a lot better controlled than it used to be. Next, please. I think the other thing we looked at, which was quite interesting, I mentioned the shift between counterfeit and contraband. So this is EU data, and this is the level of genuine product that is being shipped across borders in the EU to take advantage of differences in tobacco taxation levels. And what is really interesting to us is the dramatic reduction in that level of cross-border flow of genuine product. But a big piece of that is because that volume is being picked up in counterfeit product in illicit ways. And the distribution systems for counterfeit tobacco across Europe are really very well established. And you know, in doing this research, one of the things we found was just the impact of illicit tobacco on underage smoking as well. Because what we found is that the kids were actually part of the distribution system. You know, in a parallel piece of work that we did, we interviewed 6,000 consumers to find out how they acquired their illicit tobacco. And it was very common, the parents send the kid down the road to the corner store, the gas station, where they pick up their illicit cigarettes in a brown paper basket. So the kids were part of the system already and getting into that whole world of smoking, which was a nasty byproduct of this. Tobacco companies are facing a much tougher regulatory regime than they used to face. And I think it's fair to say of all of the big four tobacco companies, you know, clearly recognize that illicit trade is very much to their financial disadvantage. And so we see a whole number of things that are now happening in the tobacco companies, consistent with regulation, but also consistent with self-interest in terms of their own business economics. You know, the rules around knowing your customer and validating any new customer, knowing your suppliers and providing those suppliers are not participating also in the illegal market. Huge amounts of security. We talked about supply chain and GS1, but track and trace is going to be a big theme going forward for the industry, mirroring what's done in pharmaceuticals now. So you're probably aware, both in the EU and the US, every single pack of a prescribed drug now has a unique pack level identifier that can be scanned at the point of retail to make sure that pack is valid and not an illicit pack in Kenya today. And that initiative came out of work done years ago, starting in the US, about the level of counterfeit product going through pharmacies, which was very high. So those controls are being put in place and are effective. Tobacco will mirror that. Over the next couple of years, you will have the same type of identifier, QR code or whatever technology is used to make sure that every single pack can be validated, assuming it's going through a legitimate point of sale to be a legitimate pack. Problem is that most illicit tobacco doesn't go through legitimate points of sale. It bypasses them. It doesn't go through the till of the retailer. So it's not foolproof, but it will help. And I think the other thing is probably worth talking about, just mentioning at least, is the cooperative partnerships that are being set up between the big tobacco companies and to my knowledge, across the EU, are proving valuable in terms of interception. But it's quite interesting. Although this study was sponsored by JTI, we had contributions from a number of the other tobacco companies, and we were interviewing the AIT team at Imperial Brands. It's a UK-based tobacco company. JTI is based in Switzerland, and Imperial have a team who do nothing but search the web for evidence of sales of counterfeit tobacco and inform then the enforcement authorities to go and intervene. And JTI, other tobacco companies do very similar things. So what we're seeing is AIT organizations and tobacco companies becoming very sophisticated about the tools they use and passing information to the enforcement authorities when they've got something they think that should be acted on. Next slide. You look at, were you about to say something, Liz? I'm almost done.
Okay.
Almost done. So I think that collaboration we see as being hugely important. You'll see in the report, when I said we'll circulate that, you'll see some of the very specific examples of interceptions, and some of these are huge in scale. But I think the conclusion we drew from this work was that where governments can work closely with the manufacturers and their AIT teams, then there is a big win in terms of controlling illicit. Where governments feel they should not collaborate because they are seen to be too connected to the tobacco companies, we believe that can be disadvantageous. Next slide. I'll skip over these. There were two examples of UK and Romania where that collaboration has been very effective. You'll see that in the report. And let's just go to the conclusions, because I think it's worth going to. That's fine. So I think when you look at what all that tells you, the conclusions are pretty clear. When you read the report and see the data, I think you'll draw the same conclusions that we did, which is that high and increasing levels of tobacco taxation are the principal catalyst for growth in illicit trade, in particular absent strengthening enforcement alongside increasing tobacco taxes. It's driven by affordability. It's the tax that's driving the affordability of cigarettes, or the reduction in affordability. And the profit opportunities are absolutely huge. So I think government, enforcement, tobacco companies, where they can work together in the right way, you have the opportunity to get at a lot more of the illicit trade than you would otherwise do so. But absolutely, the number one message we'd ask anybody to take away from this is, if you are going to, for matters of public health or finance, increase tobacco taxes, don't do it without looking at enforcement, because you need the enforcement to make sure the controls are in place to stop that just driving up illicit trade, and from a government and a fiscal point of view, being self-defeating, because you lose the tax revenue anyway because it goes into the illicit channel. So that was a quick gallop through. Very happy to share the presentation. Very happy and probably more relevant to share the report. This is the report. We can send a soft copy of this to anyone who's interested. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. I expect you will have some questions and queries, comments that you want to raise. We do have time for one or two questions. I see you there. Before we get to that, what I would like to just mention, do look at an OECD report called Converging Criminal Networks. There's a lot of information in there. It's hundreds of pages. There is a chapter on tobacco, a chapter on alcohol, wildlife crime, and the research done by the OECD suggests that the criminals involved in the illegal trade in all these goods use the same distribution methods, the same people, the same routes, and they target the same people who are usually the most deprived in our communities. The illicit tobacco trade, Lawrence mentioned targeting young people, because of course young people are not able to buy cigarettes legitimately in a retail outlet. So they do target young people. They do target school children. And the same sort of targeting happens with illegal alcohol, drugs, weapons, you name it. And one of the things the UK has done on the tobacco side is develop a lot of awareness and education and campaigns that actually involve reaching out to parents to increase awareness that their children are being tempted to buy illicit cigarettes, and that will then lead them on to other things, hard drugs, weapons, etc. And that has actually been successful over about 5 years in reducing some of the illicit consumption, but it's still there.
Yeah, Liz, maybe worth mentioning, what part of the motivation for the study was because of the bad nature of that trade.
Yep.
Exactly as you said.
Yeah. So the OECD report, Converging Criminal Networks, I think it was 1915 or 16. Supply chain controls, Lawrence mentioned, and a reference to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Illicit Trade Protocol. That's a big issue for many of you. And I would just say that bear in mind, when your governments are thinking about controls and supply chain, that whatever you have needs to be interoperable. Think about your mobile phones. They work in any country in the world because they work to an international standard. The tax stamps that many of you have are actually old-fashioned, at the basis of having a tender process, introducing tax stamps from one supplier that everyone has to use. That is no longer, shall we say, good practice in the modern world, because if each country adopts something different, and we're talking about a global trade, porous borders, criminals who work across countries and continents, then the enforcement people cannot use track and trace if each country has something different. So what is being advocated now, and I know the OECD is also working on this, is an international standard, GS1, that all software suppliers for these unique identifiers should be accredited to. So you no longer have the situation of a government tender and one supplier. You have the opportunity for any licensed manufacturer to purchase the system that is accredited to an international standard that enforcement authorities around the world can use to help in their investigations and their detections. So that is the latest scenario on supply chain controls. Forget tax stamps, unique identifiers to international standard is the way things are going. So questions? Yes, the lady there. Have we got a... Oh, I think we'll have to take the microphone to you.
That's fine, I think I do. Hi, Lauren. Just a quick question. You mentioned that you looked at about 28 countries, and I just saw on one of the graphs South Africa was up there. I'm just curious in terms of the other African countries that were considered in that research, because I think that there seems to be a general issue in terms of access to data, and more specifically good data. And market dynamics are, of course, very different on our continent as compared to the EU. So I was just curious about that point and whether you have any comment on data that's available from the continent.
Well, the countries that we chose, by and large, were the countries we had good data for. And the view that the team took at the time was those 28 countries which we focused on, we had sufficient reliable data to really do the study for. Most of the Central African countries, the view taken at the time, this was about 12 months ago, was that the data were not as strong as the other countries. So, yeah, we'd love to have looked at more African countries, but we focused on the countries where we were confident in the data.
Do you know if anybody is looking at the other African countries in terms of trying to drill down and get data?
Jeremy from Euromonitor might want to comment on that, actually.
Sure. I'm doing a presentation on illicit alcohol in the main focus is Tanzania.
Okay.
And there is a lot of data there. It's actually quite a data-heavy project based on time research. And I'm also going to touch on some other markets that we looked at recently, Uganda and Malawi.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Lawrence will be available for the rest of the morning, so you can grab him in the coffee break if you want to have a private word about any of your issues. I understand, Beatrice, that all the presentations will be circulated to delegates. Yes. So you don't need to take notes unless you want to. Because of time, I would like to say thank you very much to Lawrence.
A pleasure. Thank you, Liz.
And move on to the next one, which is me.
There you go.
I don't know if I need two microphones, actually. I think one microphone is probably enough. So I omitted to say at the start, so thank you very much to the Kenya Revenue Authority for giving us this opportunity to talk about illicit trade. Lawrence mentioned, actually, that in the UK, where I come from, there was a much higher degree of illicit trade. And I said in my introduction that I was privileged to lead the first UK review of illicit alcohol and tobacco in 1997. And that came about because we had a lot of pressure from the industry to do something about illegal trade. And by industry, I mean retail industry. Now, this is a presentation about illicit alcohol, but there's a very similar presentation I have, and a lot of information I have about tobacco. We estimated at about 2000 that illicit tobacco in the UK was about 23%. Through a similar strategy to this, we have reduced it to about 10%. And one of the big things I would say to all of you is, if you can, have an objective, independent study to estimate the size of illicit trade in your countries in alcohol and tobacco products. So that gives you a better understanding of what's happening. It gives you a benchmark to measure progress in tackling the illicit trade, and it gives you, most of all, some ammunition for your politicians to persuade them to give you what you need with high taxes, and that is good enforcement. This is what we've used the measurements for in the UK. We have annual tax gap estimates. The UK tax gap methodology for all our taxes is available online. You just Google UK tax gap and you will find lengthy documents. There's one on methodology and there's one on the actual estimates each year that we are using to track our effectiveness in reducing illegal trade. So what I'm going to talk about here is the issues. Prior to 1993 in alcohol tax in the UK, there was very little fraud. Why was that? It was because we weren't members of the single market. We had control of our own borders, and we had very robust control on manufacturing internally and robust control at our borders. But of course, once we signed up to the single market in the EU, that all went. And I'm warning to you in customs unions, your controls are only as good as the weakest member, and you have porous borders. We have suffered, you heard from the tobacco presentation, we have suffered particularly from porous borders in Eastern Europe, where enforcement is not very good still, and where there's high levels of corruption. So think when you're going into a customs union, and if each country has different levels of domestic taxes for VAT and for excise, the same thing will happen unless you have very, very good enforcement. So it's one of the lessons we've learnt from the EU. In fact, don't do it. And you can gather from that that I'm keen on our exit from the EU, because we've lost so much money in this area to the criminals. So here we are, abolition of internal borders. And of course, nobody expected this to happen. 1993. Nobody really expected it. So can we move on? And by the time we came to 1997-98, big pressure from the retailers, especially alcohol and tobacco retailers in the UK. And that's what led to the first alcohol and tobacco fraud review that I led. And we identified a need to have a robust methodology to estimate tax gaps, and on the back of that, to develop strategies, national and international strategies, to combat illicit trade in alcohol and tobacco products. So alcohol consumption nowadays generates £10.5 billion in excise duty alone. And there's VAT on top of that. That can fund a lot of public services, our health service, our education service, etc. That's what tax we get. It's a dynamic sector, and the customers do change their brand preferences. As tax goes up, they may downtrade to a lesser brand. But the industry in the UK, you've probably heard of Scotch whisky. It's a significant UK export. UK is the 4th biggest exporter of beer in the European Union, and Scotch whisky exports, one of our top 10 export earners, were worth £3.9 billion in 2014. I'm sorry, I don't know what that means in shillings, so I hope you can understand that that is just very big, okay? Since 2005, when HM Revenue and Customs introduced its first strategy to tackle illicit trade in spirits, progress has been considerable. But the illicit alcohol market still costs us £1.2 billion a year. That's what we think we're losing, roughly. These estimates are never precise, but it's good enough to persuade our politicians to give us the enforcement tools we need. And if we can go back, can we go back, please? Yeah. What we know is there's a lot of criminality involved. Large-scale international criminal organisations are benefiting from this illegal trade. And actually, I'll refer to the tobacco illegal trade. We know now, there is evidence, particularly from the State Department in the US, and also the UK has some evidence that the illicit trade in tobacco products is actually funding terrorist organisations. You probably remember Mr. Marlborough, who earned his money from illicit tobacco in North Africa, and they blew up, I think it was a refinery that resulted in many deaths. But apart from that, the latest research, which I've seen from Pricewaterhouse in India, was that 20% of the ISIS funding comes from tobacco smuggling, particularly in the Middle East. So this is big criminal, nasty criminal organisations and terrorists benefiting from illegal trade because they get a lot of money from it. So, UK alcohol tax gap, 8% of alcohol tax revenue goes uncollected as a result of fraud and error. The biggest problem is what we call inward diversion, and that is in the internal EU market, where large criminal consignments come in, usually to Eastern Europe, sometimes to the major ports in containers, and end up on the UK markets because we have got a very, very high tax rate on alcohol, as indeed on tobacco products. Other frauds, such as illicit production, under declaration, non-payment of liabilities exist, but they're not significant. Mostly we have no problem with production controls. We do have problems with internal customs union smuggling across the EU. And the criminals infiltrate alcohol supply chains at multiple stages, which means that we have legitimate businesses who find themselves involved in dealing in illegal products. And no doubt this is the same in your countries, where a legitimate retailer, and indeed wholesaler, will have the legal goods ready for you to inspect if you go around, but then somewhere in a back store or a local house, whatever it is, they will also have the illegal stores that they sell to their well-known friends and customers. So, what we've done in the UK, the strategy we've adopted has been successful, increasing the revenue protected to over £1 billion a year. And part of this has been due, in fact a large part has been due to the strong links we've forged with other countries and with other enforcement agencies, both at home and abroad. And we work closely with legitimate businesses and trade bodies, trade associations, to address this problem. No revenue authority or customs authority ever has enough resources. If you think about your customs authorities, you probably do not inspect more than about 5%. That's the average that goes through a scanner across the world. And only 2% is the world average for actual physical inspections of containers at borders. So you cannot expect your customs authorities to stop all illegal trade. It's just not feasible. And the 2010 strategy in the UK focused solely on tackling fraud, and we decided that we needed to reform the law and the processes. Okay? Yeah. So the supply chain risks. We looked at the production risks. Well, criminals need a regular supply. Their customers expect a regular supply of the same quality goods. They're satisfied with them. So these goods are smuggled somehow into the UK. And duty evasion usually occurs when goods are diverted from the continent, for us in Europe, and criminals insert goods into otherwise legitimate retail supply chains. Okay. So we reduced spirits fraud, protected revenue of over 3.6 billion. We also decided to digitize all the documentation requirements for the alcohol trade, the production, the movements, particularly part of an overall EU system called EMCS, which notifies other countries of goods moving under duty suspension. And we introduced anti-fraud measures such as due diligence. And there is an ITIC toolkit on know your supplier, know your customer, which can easily make available to you. And that sets out good practice that you should expect to see in any well-run production facility of either tobacco products or alcohol. Anyway, we introduced measures working with businesses to secure the supply chain, tightened up the regulatory framework to try and prevent and reduce opportunities for fraud, worked with other public sector bodies, including our Ministry of Health, and that's for both tobacco and alcohol. They have paid for massive awareness campaigns and things like posters in our local pharmacies, in our hospitals and clinics, warning people about the dangers of illicit tobacco products and alcohol and who to contact if they have any information. So what we've got here, since the 2010 strategy, we've seized 50 million litres of illicit alcohol, duty value 106 million, levied penalties of over 84 million, and the losses protected, and we do have a figure for losses protected, that is the revenue that we would otherwise have lost, exceeding 1 billion in 2015. And we now have a computerized system, which makes it easier both for businesses to move goods within the EU and easier for HMRC to identify fraud risks. But that system cost a lot of money. I was responsible for the UK side of it when I was working there. And at that point, it was costing something like £50 million just for the UK side of this. The project took about 10 years to actually get into place. So it was a very big IT project, very costly, but because of the issues that all countries were losing money on, it was deemed necessary. Needless to say, we still have illicit trade, and they found ways round it. Whatever you do, the criminals tend to find another way of getting their products into the marketplace. Okay. So, in 2014, we established a joint alcohol anti-fraud task force with industry, strengthened links with the police, with our consumer protection people called trading standards. I guess you all have consumer protection people who look at labelling in retail stores and make sure that the contents comply with the labels, etc. Well, they work with the Revenue and Customs in helping to identify illegal goods, which meant Revenue and Customs had to train them, give them some awareness of what to look for, how to identify counterfeits, and who to contact if they suspect there is either counterfeits or parallel goods on the shelves. So the fraud continues to change. They always find another way around it. Thank you. So where we are now, a new alcohol strategy aimed to maximise alcohol revenue by promoting good compliance, making it easier for businesses to pay the right duties. We heard a lot yesterday about making it easy for people to pay. And I think back to a rather more famous customs officer than myself, Mr. Adam Smith, you may have heard of if you're an economist. One of the canons of taxation was make compliance easy. The others, I think, were proportionality, which doesn't really apply to excise, as that's a regressive tax, and efficiency, that the tax should not cost too much to collect, it should be an efficient tax. And I'm trying to think what the other one was. Proportionality, efficiency, compliance. There's another one, which will come to me. Anyway, preventing tax losses, making it harder to make mistakes or cheat, and increasing the impact of enforcement with stronger legislation, including the ability to seize and requirement to destroy not only the goods seized, but also the mode of transport. And for tobacco products, the UK has seized an aeroplane and forced it to stay in place for 3 days when it was found that the cabin crew were busy involved in a smuggling chain. That sent a good message to the aeroplane industry, and as far as we know, it hasn't happened since. Because it costs rather a lot to keep a large aeroplane grounded at Heathrow for a long time. Anyway, the UK strategy is intended to level the playing field for legitimate businesses. They're the ones who are losing out just as much as the revenue, perhaps not as much in terms of money, but it means profits, it means jobs for the legal businesses. And part of the UK tax ethos is to support legitimate businesses, to help small and medium businesses grow in the marketplace, and to assist in developing our export capacity. So this is another key driver for all the tax regimes in the UK. So next one. Simplifying tax. We heard a bit yesterday about simplifying. Well, we have got very complex taxation, particularly on the direct tax side. There's a now move to try and simplify as far as possible, to digitise everything. We intend to have all our tax regimes digitised by 2020. I think we're well on the way to that. And streamlining the processes to support businesses, so you get a quicker approval, a quicker turnaround if you are applying for a licence, if you're applying for import approval, etc. So that's all part of trying to support legal trade. Okay. So there's a lot more sharing, a lot more trust between government and industry. And we're targeting communications, because what I said, I think, at the beginning was the criminals target young people for illicit alcohol and tobacco products, and they also target the poorest in our communities. I think the purchasers of illicit tobacco and alcohol are 8 times more likely to come from our poorest communities than from the wealthiest. So this is an issue about poverty and development as well as about illegal trade. And we support businesses by providing guidance, assistance, seminars. Again, there was a lot of talk about that yesterday, about working closely with trade associations and business to make sure they understand what is required. Okay. We're going to continue to work with them to try and get a better understanding of how criminals retain access. We depend a lot on intelligence, international intelligence, working with Interpol, working with the World Customs Organization, with the OECD, although that is more on policies than on intelligence, but working with Europol and with the EU detection agency, fraud agency, OLAF. And whilst I've been saying lots of things that I don't like about the EU does have a very effective mechanism for sharing intelligence and for working together to tackle illegal trade, criminals, and in particular terrorists. And I'm sure that will continue after Brexit because it's in everyone's best interests. And we continue to invest in skills and capability because it's a very, well, digitised world, lots of different things happening. We've heard yesterday about Bitcoin and blockchain, and I know we have data analysts busy in the UK, a lot of emphasis on intelligence and data analysts and people spending their whole days, and I can't imagine this, looking at the dark web, trying to find out who's behind things, taking down websites, etc. Because a lot of the issues we're having now are due to e-commerce, people purchasing illegal products, often from the Far East, coming in through separate packages, and that's particularly for tobacco products, through our mail services, lots and lots of individual packages, almost impossible to control, though we do now have scanners in all our mail depots and agreements with the main carriers, DHL and so on, which I would commend to you because these bodies also want to help legitimate business. So what we want to do, it's not over. We're not complacent. We're trying to target the criminal gangs, focus on highest risk individuals. And the UK has named and shamed the 50 top wanted tax fraudsters, and about 20 of those were tobacco smugglers. Not so many on the alcohol side, but once a year we do name and shame, put photographs in, a little description of who they are, what they've done, and etc. And we name and shame on a local basis too, for less serious offences, and that is something worth considering in your legislation. Because if someone is involved at a local level in distribution of illegal goods, then naming and shaming in their local community, together with the appropriate financial penalty, tends to have a big impact because nobody really wants their parents and their relatives to know that they've been involved in something criminal, do they? And that has had a good impact. Anyway, so what do? We seize goods, we seize vehicles, vessels, we seize cash, criminal prosecution, custodial sentence up to 7 years, confiscation of assets. That seems to have a greater impact on criminals than actually seizing goods or a fine. Seizing their ill-gotten gains. And as far as we can, we try to do that. We're up against the issues of tax havens and complex financial transactions. So it's all to do with illicit financial flows. And again, you heard about some of that yesterday. It is a key part of the excise smuggling side. We assess for loss of duty. Financial wrongdoing penalties. That's the local distributor. Up to 100% of the duty due, civil action, fines, revocation of excise approvals. Approval to be a manufacturer or a transporter of excise goods in duty suspension is a privilege, not a right. It's a privilege that the revenue authorities should be able to suspend or completely remove, put them out of business. Withdraw hauliers operators licenses, naming and shaming I've mentioned, and that's it. A quick run through the alcohol strategy we have in the UK. We have a tobacco strategy, very similar. Both have been successful, but because there's money involved and it's a perception that, oh, well, I won't get caught, and often the people behind it live far away in their nice villas somewhere or other. You know, it's going to go on. Whatever you do, it will go on. And I can't commend highly enough what Lawrence was saying. If you're going to put up tax rates on alcohol and tobacco, which is what we have done in the UK, for very good reasons, for revenue and for health reasons, you have to invest in enforcement. And just recently, in the last, I think of the last year and a half, we have had approval for an extra 1,500 enforcement staff working on excise fraud. And that includes, I think, 25 officials stationed around the world as fiscal crime liaison officers. So think about it. Yes, you can raise taxes effectively, but only if you've got really good enforcement. And you're only as good, as I said, as your weakest member of a customs union and your most porous border. And I know that's a big issue for people here. So that's it for me for now. If you've got any questions, do ask. I shall be around for the rest of the day. I have my cards here that you're welcome to take and email me if you want something. If you want information on anything, I'm very happy to provide it to you if I can. So, where we are now, I think, is the next session, which, according to my schedule, is Euromonitor, talking about alcohol. Yes, where's the other microphone?
It's behind you.
It's behind me, okay.
I turned it off, by the way.
Okay, so I'd like you to welcome Mr. Jeremy Golden from Euromonitor International, and he's going to be talking about some research study that has been done on illicit alcohol in Tanzania and I think some of the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
That's great. And I'll just cue you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I better talk into the mic. Before I start, I just want to say a big, big thank you to the Kenya Revenue Authority to allow me to come and present. It's a great honor to actually be here in Nairobi to talk about the subject of illicit alcohol, specifically with a focus on Tanzania. And the last presentation that I did was actually on a very similar topic, looking at illicit alcohol in Uganda. The difference being I had to do this over the Skype telephone to a conference at 3 in the morning. So this is a big, big change for the better. So I appreciate it. I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about our methodology, as well as reviewing all the data in detail, because this is quite a data-specific project. And obviously, as with all the other presentations, you will have a chance to review the data in detail. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to speak now as I'm presenting. But also, you have my contact details on the presentation itself. So I want to start just, and again, very briefly, by talking about, well, first I'm going to talk about Euromonitor International, and that will take a minute or two. Then I want to talk about our methodology. How do we size illicit alcohol? The definitions that we include. We're going to do a brief cross-country comparison of 3 markets in sub-Saharan Africa. Then we're going to focus on Tanzania, as I mentioned, key findings there. And then we're going to do a more of a deep look at Tanzania and where the illicit alcohol problem actually constitutes, where does it manifest. Okay, so this is us, Euromonitor, with the world's largest publicly owned, I beg your pardon, privately owned business intelligence market. We have offices all around the world, including in Cape Town, where we conduct much of, or manage much of our research. And our focus really is on fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG, the kind of products you and I would buy in a grocery store, supermarket, including alcoholic beverages, tobacco, hot drinks, cleaning products, makeup, and so on. That's what we cover. If we can go on to the next slide, please. This is very broad. These are basically different areas of research which I am involved in. Ad hoc research, custom research, meaning clients commission us to do studies only for them, and that research and the results belong to our client. And typically, a research project would take around 12 to 14 weeks, sometimes longer, and the core focus, which we'll look at in a moment, is on primary research, i.e. interviewing in the market. And so the key, I suppose, strength of what we do is that we have analysts in the markets who are interviewing, so they themselves know the industry well, they have contacts, they speak the language, and they will be doing the interviews managed by a research manager or a consultant such as myself. Okay, so you'll find in these slides there is quite a lot of detail, and I think just for the sake of time and so on, what I want you to really think about here is what are clients asking us to do, because we have been commissioned to study illicit alcohol for more than 10 years now, and not only in Africa, particularly in Latin America, Central America, and in Eastern Europe. As you were saying, a lot of problems stem from there. So here we have the categories, which we'll look at in a moment. So counterfeit, smuggling or contraband, homebrew, tax leakage, and surrogate, which are then broken down into two types of alcohol. Distilled, which is a spirit, fermented, which is more like a beer or an opaque beer, for example. And so the clients, who are the big distillery companies, mainly the big spirit companies that you're well familiar with, they commission us to do this work, and often we will do it year after year. So, for instance, my colleague Lourdes, who is the global expert, I would say, on illicit alcohol, just because of the, in terms of the methodology that we use, she has been doing illicit alcohol in Peru for about 6 years now, and tracking the development of illicit alcohol. Anyway, the objective of, the key objective really is this, which is to size the market for how big is the market in the latest year, and why do customers buy it, and also what role do the regulatory environment play in allowing or not allowing illicit alcohol to flourish. And then we look at the value chain. How does the illicit alcohol get from the illegal importers or from the local producers to the end consumer? We track in detail the supply chain, and it's one of the most important things that we do. Okay, so in essence, we start with secondary research. A typical project like illicit alcohol in Tanzania would be about 16 weeks, 4 months more or less. We do a lot of store observations. We go into more than 20, 25 stores, and we cover different regions. We go into bars, clubs, what are called on-trade. We observe. We don't buy any illicit alcohol or drink it, but we do track prices and any sort of activity that is considered to be illicit. But the core focus really is on the in-depth trade interviews. We do around 40 in-depth interviews of around 45 minutes to an hour with government officials involved in police, quality standards, border control, taxation, registration, licensing, and so on and so forth. So lots of discussions with government officials. We talk to distilleries, importers, brewers, and all kinds of people who are involved in the trade in one form or another. So you could say that it's a consensus, really, of the market in terms of how big the illicit market is. And this is a sort of a key point to our methodology, which is, as I was saying, we track the illicit activity throughout the chain, but to avoid double counting, we only look at the illicit activity where it first becomes apparent. So, for example, if ethanol is being smuggled in from India into Uganda to make spirits in sachets by unbranded or unregistered distilleries in Kampala, it's that illicit smuggling of ethanol into Uganda where it happens. That's what we would consider to be the first kind of link in the chain that we measure. Okay, so these are the categories that we have covered, or we cover always. It never varies. It's in essence, we look at, I'm not going to go through every one because it's there and I think probably quite clear for everybody. If anybody has a question about it after you've had a chance to read it, please let me know. Some of the terms, smuggling is also contraband, it's the same term. Homebrew sometimes has other words, is sometimes called artisanal, and so on. But I think the key point about homebrew is it's when homebrew is made usually locally and it's sold commercially. That is when we consider it illicit because tax has not been paid on it. And I'm sure the audience is well aware that there is a large constituent within a market where fermented homebrew is made as part of a tradition, where it's consumed locally. It's not. It's a cultural traditions and so on, which may not be charged for. I think, and to an extent, the governments may allow this to happen as something that is not so serious. Our focus really, you have to say, for our study is more on distilled homebrew. It's homebrew that's made in possibly quite a sophisticated way, but it uses spirits, lots of ingredients are added to it, and it's completely unregulated and uncontrolled. That is one of the key kind of problems in a lot of this illicit alcohol, because regardless of taxation issue, which is really why we're here today and very important, and we'll look at the fiscal loss implications in a moment, the fact is, as my colleagues were saying, younger people are starting to drink alcohol at a younger and younger age. And part of that is because it is widely available in an illicit form. It's not regulated. And the other point to mention here is these huge health problems that have arisen due to early drinking and excess drinking and all the same, and sort of related problems. I mean, my strong interest is also in development and the welfare of vulnerable populations that are exposed to very dangerous alcohol, and tax is part of the problem. Okay, so this was a study that was done in 2016, but what we were asked to do was to track the latest year, end of year. So the figures that you'd want to look at really, at the top you've got the total alcohol market volume, which is licit or legal and illicit illegal. And it's in hectoliters, which is hundreds of liters, and LAE, which is the legal alcohol equivalent. And this is really, really important because most organizations like the WHO, not to mention how alcohol is taxed, it's based on the legal equivalent, the amount of alcohol that's there. And that's really important. So if you see something like opaque beer, you know, there's vast volumes of opaque beer that's drunk, but actually the LAE is very, very small. You know, so that's something to consider. So the illicit market, which is, you know, if you add the 2 zeros to make it hectoliters, it's actually it's around almost 10 million liters is illicit. So the illicit volume is actually larger than the licit volume. And nobody in Malawi has challenged our findings. They haven't. No one said that's ridiculous, you know. It's just a question of scale. And many actually were thinking it was perhaps even bigger than that. And so this brings us to the fiscal loss. What we're asked to do is ultimately, based on the product and the volume of that illicit product and the tax that should have been paid on it, we calculate the fiscal loss. So the fiscal loss for 2015 is 80 million. Can we go on to Uganda, please? The next one. Yeah. Okay. So Uganda is, excuse me for saying, I'm sure, very obvious things to an audience. It's a massive, massive market for alcohol, regulated, unregulated. It's huge. It's part of the social and communal and cultural life. But there is a massive problem of illicit spirits in particular. Again, the illicit market is 67 million liters, which is far larger than the licit market. And the fiscal loss is 172 million, which is huge. Okay, on to the next one. And then here we have the market that I want to look at today, briefly, and which is Tanzania. Again, you're seeing a common theme. I mean, the licit and licit or legal and illegal, it's fairly equal, but the illegal market is still much larger, and the fiscal loss is 110 million. What this means, this is the value that we estimated of which the illicit products were sold at in the market. You know, whether it was in clubs, bars, kind of small kiosks and all the rest of it. That's the sort of accumulated loss, or it's the accumulated value, I should say, of unregulated and untaxed, which is this. Okay, so these are some of our key findings, and they will reflect some of the issues that we've already mentioned before, which is to do with high poverty rates fueling large volumes of drinking, particularly among unemployed people. Distilled homebrew has the greatest hectoliter LAE. It's produced in unsavory, dangerous conditions. It's not monitored. It's not regulated. There's also quite a lot of counterfeiting of popular brands. So they're brands that look like the real thing, but they contain cheap alcohol that's been filtered with other things and water and stuff. There's a lot of smuggling going on. Borders are weak. The government has introduced new regulation to restrict purchase of alcohol during daytime, but it's very easy to get around that through buying sachets and so on. The most recent regulation was to ban sachets completely. That's been put into force this year, and only spirits to be sold in glass bottles, returnable glass bottles. I mean, it remains to be seen whether this will be enforced. You know, they are huge, as I saw in Uganda and in Zambia. There's quite a big disconnect often between the time something is regulated, when it's implemented, and then the actual enforcement of regulation. It's a big issue. Less here, but certainly in Tanzania. Okay. So this is looking here at the health implications, really, which we've talked about before. I mean, the very stark number is that 10% of the country overdrinks, which is a big number, clearly. And the problem is becoming more serious. And the other point about the unregulated spirit market is how widespread it is. Production takes place in kind of under the radar in rural areas, and spirits is transported all over Tanzania, and it's allowed to happen. It's quite visible in some cases. So it's a very sophisticated process that's taking place, particularly for smuggling, which are run by big cartels, as you see in other countries as well. Okay, I mean, I don't want to, there are a lot of numbers here. They're important numbers, and obviously I hope you'll have time to review them at a later stage. I mean, this is, in essence, the market in volume. The illicit is in purple, and the legal or licit is in grey. And so this is the volume, and this is the value. So you can see quite an interesting comparison there, because the illicit volume is far higher than the value of illegal alcohol, indicating that people are buying cheaper products for obvious reasons. But the point is that the illicit market is continuing to grow in Tanzania. It's not something which is under control in any sense. It's a huge, huge problem, as we've said. There is a lot of bribery and corruption in different elements, particularly at the border. And so cartels can smuggle products in, knowing that they will not be stopped, or being forewarned by officials about, you know, possible raids and so on. So there is a lot of you know, illegal activity which is basically allowed to happen. It's very much in the open. And I think the last point really is, you know, the ease at which you can buy alcohol, and that is really something that is quite shocking, where you see the sachets everywhere, market stalls, and so we're not just talking about bars, clubs, you know, a small grocery store. It's very prevalent everywhere, and there's no restriction, as I said, in terms of who can buy it, not to mention the products themselves. And there's so much that those illegal manufactured spirits are incredibly dangerous, and so they're in sachet or in glass. They may have an attractive label that looks like a brand that you would recognize, But other than that, there's nothing in it which is really good for human consumption. It's a dangerous product. Okay. So I think these brief points are just some context to the market outlook. You know, our sense is that illicit production and distribution of distilled homebrew in particular is going to grow and grow because the demand is there, and particularly where you see high price increases or tax increases of sort of popular spirits like cognac brands, then you'll see a surge in trading down either to legal brands or illegal brands, cheaper ones. You know. And so unless there is going to be a firm commitment by authorities to really take the initiative, as I said, yes, they have banned sachets, yes, they've stopped people buying alcohol during working hours, but now it's really about implementation. But it's also about enforcement and punishment. You know, are they going to stop people's licenses? Are they going to send them to prison? Are they going to fine them? If they're not going to do this, it's not going to work, really. Okay. These are just very briefly. We're looking at the different types of illicit activity. I'm sorry, it's probably hard for you to read, but in essence, the 83.3% volume is illicit homebrew. That is made mainly locally and distributed quite widely, and the same for the value. The main activity in value is illicit homebrew, and then in volume terms, the next one is counterfeit, and then smuggling, and then the smaller one is tax leakage, which is where legitimate companies underdeclare what they're actually producing, and it's a huge problem in Tanzania. We saw in Zambia, in Uganda, and it's part of this issue. It's not just illegal distilleries off the radar that nobody knows about. It's also legal entities who are under-declaring what's really going on. Okay, we're coming to the final stages. This is the illicit or legal, so you can see that clear beer and lager is by far the largest volume, but spirits is also large as well. This is all hectoliters. And then in the illicit alcohol, which is we've looked at before, it then breaks down into the different kinds of alcohol categories. So it's almost all illicit homebrew, but it's also spirits, and a little less, much smaller, is wine and lager. And this is the same chart, but it's value. And in value, it's quite similar, the outlook. The big difference is that the second largest illicit category is the spirits, which are not homebrew distilled spirits. It's illegal spirits, which are smuggled, like, you know, premium vodkas and brandies, etc., as well as counterfeit. Okay, I think we'll skip to the next one. Thank you. Okay, we are coming to the end now, and I like this this graphic because it shows very clearly where you look at each alcohol category, which is the illicit activity most strongly associated with it in volume terms. So for illicit spirits, which is 65% of the total spirits market, 35% is legal spirits. Within that 65%, 79% is distilled homebrew, the rest is industrial manufacturing and so on. So it's a very sort of transparent way of looking at these different things, and it's all defined if you need to cross-reference. Okay, and I think the last slide, these are the, thank you. This gives you some context to the relevance, which beverages, and where does this take place in relation to spirits sold in sachets. And it talks about, for example, the sugarcane and molasses mainly being used for it, and also some illegal imports of ethanol to make these sachet products known as viroba. As I said, viroba has been banned as of this year, but we have to see what the impact is. And then, and now we're looking at some of the drivers of viroba. It's high excise duty, uncontrolled availability, harsher economic situations, as well as counterfeit products, which are products that look very much like the real brands that people love and trust, but they are, as I said, containing low quality spirits. Okay, and then this finally, it's the illicit homebrew, which I think we've covered already. And I'll just conclude very much that I think when we talk about the problems of Tanzania, really the key is about illicit spirits or homebrew in particular, just because of the sheer volume, the scale, the number of people, the youth aspect of it. It's absolutely critical, really, for these products to. We know that they're moving to glass, but they need to be labeled, they need to be taxed, and there has to be a ceiling by which the products are taxed, a kind of viable ceiling to make, and then obviously to enforce the regulation and collection of tax. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. I expect you will want to look at his slides in detail when they are circulated to you. And I think you have contact details on the slide if anyone wants to contact Jeremy for further information. Now, because of time and because we're running 2 of these masterclasses at the same time, I'm wondering if, can I just ask Mr. Turkper, have you got time to do your presentation now? You have, because I know he's got to go into the other session. So if you've got questions for Jeremy, can you hold them until after the next session? We're going to have a tea and coffee break then, and then we'll come back and you can have more of a discussion. So can we get the presentation from Mr. Turkper, please? That's it? Brilliant. And just to start, I think Mr. Turkper may have been introduced to you yesterday or the day before, but just as some background, Seth served as the Minister of Finance of Ghana from 2013 to 2016, and he was also Deputy Minister of Finance from 2009 to 2012. And he's worked with the IMF over all sorts of different areas, including the energy sector. And during his final year as minister in Ghana, he served concurrently as Minister of Power, working on synergies between the energy and financial sectors. And, I'm very, very grateful to have someone with such experience and knowledge to be here today to share some of his knowledge and his experiences in Ghana with you. So over to you, Seth. There's a microphone here if you want it. Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me from the back? Can you hear me? Okay. This session is a very brief one. I always like to say that my first love, as I say, is revenue administration. That's where I started, and hopefully and also as minister, ended, but with a larger fiscal framework. And this is a very simple, presentation, which from the previous sessions that we've been holding, and there's been a lot on customs, which has been presented, especially the one presented by the, commissioner. This is some work that, we did ad hoc, which shows the power that you can have if you integrate tax and customs databases. And I'm particularly glad that KRA is moving in that direction of integrating tax and customs for a number of reasons, including the very first session, which I presented on transfer pricing. And I think I did draw attention to the fact that for us as developing countries, transfer pricing was all about tax havens and the shift of tax bases, which has now gone into BEPS. I saw it in one of the presentations, but I think another connection we will see clearly, and which I saw as I came for the brief period that I saw, was the illicit, financial flows, as well as from both Lizzie's presentation, as well as smuggling and other activities which are engaging the, and so you see tax and customs, merging at a higher level through the border activities. And so we'll just go through this very briefly. The key point is a good customs IT system and database having significant benefits for revenue administration. Obviously, customs is about revenue collection. But often I work as revenue officers, and I also made a point in the last session today. Those of you who were in the extractive industries, I showed that our work as revenue administrators must be seen, particularly at the senior levels, assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner, commissioner general, as being part of an overall fiscal framework. And it's interesting how we don't often see the extent to which customs data is becoming very important, or is very important for fiscal management, for monetary, statistical, and macroeconomic management in a very operational way. I'm not talking about, high-level formulas like some of what we see here. And we'll try and see that. So we are going to look at those briefly alongside how we can use customs databases, or how we have in a pilot, and we know this as customs and tax administrators, use customs information, to improve revenue administration. Of course, I mentioned the border, issues. Okay. Now, it's important for me as a revenue administrator, and let me say that functionality is always very important, including the digitization issues that we're discussing. And I was reading an IMF, document. I wanted to bring it, but forgot, which says that you can have all the embellishments. If your functionality is not strong, there's no way in which you can use the information, to any useful purpose. And therefore, I think it's important for us to understand that to be able to use customs data in very, these are fundamental basic principles, but they bear repeating. If you don't have a tax identification number, a national identification number, I think one of the panelists yesterday made a point, from the business sector, I believe is accountant, or, that the lack of identification number 19 will undermine, and we'll see how it undermines compliance. Another important one is tax office codes. And I will show, how in our systems, we should have codes for all our domestic tax offices, all of them, classify them. Those who are following segmentation, we should have them. coded according to whether they are large taxpayer offices, small taxpayer or medium taxpayer offices. We would also, this is very fundamental. We often talk about tax certification number, but not the coding of our tax offices. And if you have a very good fiscal, I think there was a discussion of IFMIS and how KRA is cooperating on the expenditure side. If you have very good functional classification, then our tax office codes should conform to the functional, the organizational codes that is used also as cost centers, because we are part of the fiscal system, we are part of the government structure. And that coding, once you have it, means that KRA can therefore also collect information across, as was being said in the, I believe the KRA official on IT was mentioning. Of course, the core functions of valuation and classification. I think the important point I want to make here is the HS or customs tariff, which is widely recognized international, thanks to WTO, are needed. And they must have an interface or integrated with the economy, first beginning with our domestic tax administrations, but then you'll be surprised, for balance of payment. And what is balance of payment? It's imports and exports. And many of us do not know that for the compilation of many of these things, they do come from the customs administration. It comes from the custom database to either the Ministry of Trade, the central bank, others. And so proper classification, using which is international, this is where, the coding is very important, particularly for the tracking of, imports and exports of goods, which starts the balance of payment. So the very fundamental basis for that is customs. Of course, we know the revenue, even GDP calculation. The economies are here, consumption, investments, then what? Exports and imports. And therefore, when you work, with the statistical services, Ghana Statistical Service or whatever, you'll be amazed at the extent, and the indirect tax function also, within the calculation of GDP. Much of that information actually comes from customs databases. And so as we develop our systems, it's not just with a view to interfaces or integration, which is very important with the domestic tax administration, but let's be mindful of the fact that customs data will be used, in the economy. When they don't have a perspective of many of these things, as revenue official, I work at a policy level and then as a ministry, and therefore it must be total integration of government systems, and this is where IFMIS comes in. Because IFMIS, after all, is government systems, but almost government activity budget starts with what? Revenue. And so whilst we have our autonomy, if we didn't have our autonomy, which is the trend in, revenue authorities, you would be in the Ministry of Finance as a revenue department of the Ministry of Finance. And then when we're talking about coding and integrating in Ministry of Finance, it will be clearer. So the fact that we are autonomous and sitting outside doesn't mean that we should be. And this is where the tax policy units should go beyond just incentives, and other things, preoccupation, and expand their perspective. Compliance enforcement, we know from post-release audits, which we do with domestic tax administration, the manipulation of invoices and the rest. But the two core areas is, what is it that the importer is bringing in? And what is it that the importer is declaring by way of turnover, by way of input tax credits, by way of refunds? Because remember, our imports VAT is collected as though it were what? An import duty. And it's going to be used as an invoice for claiming input tax credits and refunds. So if your systems are not integrated yet, you can see what you are losing already. And this is where it's very important. And this is the core area where we wanted to actually focus the discussions. But I wanted to give a bigger, picture. Okay, compliance, I think we can move on. Well, the last point is I think it is coming out from the previous presentations, because I think one of the points that was made was KRA had to establish a border control unit. Ghana had a preventive unit actually when GRA was created, and it's all about smuggling, movement of all the things that being discussed. But when you go to where heads of state are concerned now, whether you're talking about BEPS, you're talking about terrorism, you're talking about the trafficking of human beings and all that, then customs come in again. And this is where our databases, what sort of databases are we building for this high level multilateral? It has become actually international. And therefore, again, in developing our databases, we must have an eye to modules that are not traditional, if I may put it that way. Working with immigration, for example, if you want to track the movements, of people, as was just being, in the value chain that was illustrated, you need to have information about those people. You need to have, this is where the national identification number, which is unique now with all kinds of biometric features, come in and become very important. So our custom systems in developing countries, must have the core system. Of course, as with IFMIS, your core system is budget and accounting. But then you have your modules on contracting, you have your modules on, procurement, you have your modules on payroll and others. And I think similarly, customs should take that view. The core system obviously is valuation and classification and all that, but your risk management modules and things should have, the information that it takes on a wider, national perspective. And that calls for interfaces within the administration and outside the administration, data match, which is very important these days. You don't have to download and be doing, so long as they are interfaced and properly integrated, you can do it real time. And I think that a lot has been said by the IT sessions already, so we are looking at the functionality, and what is lacking. Then the taxpayer support, functions are also very important. So this is, what, faced with falling commodity prices, and the need for compliance, and to also prove the point about the importance, this was just a ad hoc exercise that was done, where we requested information from the 5,000 largest importers. In the end, we realized that we didn't need all the 5,000 because of some challenges, lack of integration interfaces. So we limited the exercise to 2,500 to 2,500. Now, this is a point for segmentation of our tax offices, because we have large taxpayer offices and we are segmenting them into what? Medium and then what? Small, or small and medium taxpayer offices. If out of 2,500, right, if out of 2,500, you have large taxpayers for many developing countries, I don't know how many are in Kenya, but 550 to 700, you hardly have 1,000. That means that for small economies, small populations like Ghana, the remaining 1,500 need to be in your small, medium, offices, right? Are we coding them to the appropriate tax offices? Do the tax offices even know that they are having transactions that should define them by customs definition as medium taxpayer offices? And this is why I made a point that it's not just about your large, your national identification or tax identification number, but it's also about whether that person who is importing, whether the declaration or the database supporting the declaration has his tax office registered and linked to the domestic tax office. Where is he operating from? And I think that was one of the revelations that came, from the exercise that we did. And then one of the reasons we had to scale it down, it was very difficult to identify 5,000 and where they are even registered because of the lack of effectiveness interface between the domestic tax, and the and the customs offices. One would say this is a no-brainer, but yes, it is the design of the system, right? And when the point came on haulage, right, maybe a KRA officials who are here, who are doing the haulage from Mombasa through the, who are the transport owners behind the trucks? We are looking at just the drivers. And they are moving millions. You will agree with me. Are they registered? We used to house, the database for every registration of vehicles. And we can rely on customs and even the haulage to determine, because it's a matter of what? Mileage plus tonnage times whatever. I believe we know how much it costs to move. This intelligence that can be done quite easily. But I bet that most of these hauliers are not in our domestic, database. It's surprising that sometimes most of our tax agents, the clearing agents, are not even registered with domestic tax offices. Is it a requirement that we should know where you are registered, right? And we know the volumes they are processing. And you can take just a standard fee that they are charging and come up with a turnover that they should be declaring to the domestic tax offices. I mean, these are some of the things that were coming, as we ask questions with this, exercise. So whether you're talking about, importers themselves who should be registered and are not registered, are not declaring properly, to transporters, to all the business around customs, and it's huge business. Are they in the domestic, tax database? This is what was. Now, so we managed to send a data from 1,500 to 2,000 to the tax offices, and I'm sure you can imagine the outcome, especially tax officers who are here with us. As I said, some tax officers, some importers and exporters, and often we focus so much on importers, not so much on exporters, because zero rated, we don't tax exports and whatever. But we go back to the BOP, balance of payment, where customs data is needed to compute the export. And I had a very interesting experience where I got a call from my president as minister, who was going, and they had given him, prepared his speech, and they picked the speech, they picked the figures from somewhere, right? So he called, and he said, what is export volume and value? Do you have the information? And then we call customs. And we have all the information on revenue. We have the information on imports for calculating effective duty rates and everything, right? But it wasn't readily available among the management information. Why? Because of the revenue focus. But interestingly, because it occurred to us that the Ministry of Trade uses that to do its trade statistics. The Ministry of Trade was using that same statistics, for import-export exercises. But the Ministry of Finance, on a regular basis, was not having this vital information, which should come as a matter of routine in the morning to the Minister of Finance, which means that the Minister of Finance's information itself is from outside the agency that is preeminent and in gathering these types of information. And so the point we are making is, can we go back? So I did make a point already about the team and how you can use it in our segmentation. VAT threshold is another one. What is the VAT threshold in Kenya? And how many importers are importing taxable goods, supplies, which is classified as such in our tariff anyway, because we have the import VAT. So we should know the taxable value, right? And it's amazing, again, when the information was extracted, how many of them we're not in the large taxpayer office, let alone the medium taxpayer offices. But it's clear that the criteria, if you were to use VAT registration as a criteria for establishing the medium taxpayer office, all of them should be registered by the medium taxpayer offices. And it was just not, available. Next. And of course, income tax, the turnover. The import is a proxy for turnover plus a margin, and that's the turnover, right? So that's the traditional one we know already, which we use in our joint audits, and others. I spoke about input tax credit and zero rating, right? The evidence should be customs. Nobody should claim input tax based on imports or zero rating based on what? Exports without a customs entry. But we know the story. We always say it. When you ask an importer, that information, when it used to be paper, was with the agent. They didn't even bother to collect it. But today we have it in the databases anyway. And so we should be able to send it to the domestic offices. Again, this was very sorely lacking, So from a very simple exercise of using customs information to see whether people were declaring, we began to see declaring for profit purposes. We began to see other areas in which the information from customs, could. Obviously, we had a lot of people practicing their voluntary compliance or self-assessments, after the notices were sent. So they didn't. Some had heard about the exercise and went to the domestic tax offices, to start declaring voluntarily before they even received the notices, because we didn't wait for the whole of the 1,005. Anytime you had 200, you sent it to the offices. Anytime you had, and so word was, I'm not sure whether the exercise is continuing. Next. So I said most of this already. What were the fundamental problems that we had? Tax custom systems not fully interfaced or integrated. Tax identification and tax office numbers not being in the... And we had a situation where, you should have a situation where, frankly, because registration has to be done in the tax office, right? The Mombasa office of customs, being part of GRA, should actually be issuing tax, sending information. If somebody comes and he hasn't got it, he has to fill the registration and send it to his domestic tax office. But this was not, part of the configuration. And this is how, we rope in, taxpayers who are outside the tax nets. I mean, these are measures that followed after the exercise. So the major customs offices were not helping with the enforcement of registration, right? And one of the things we ensured was to make sure that both the tax office number, the TIN is already there as part of the declaration, but the tax office number is what we're talking about. And no formal program existed for exchange, even though domestic tax offices have access rights only, but I think it should be fully interfaced and integrated, and that is where many of our tax administrations are going, and that is where we understand KRA is going. Next. So I think we've gone through many of these: VAT registration, threshold, input tax credits, excise administration. I think we've heard enough already to let us. I deliberately kept this because I knew there was going to be a lot, which from the presentations that are being made on excise we can relate easily, to, because there's a domestic element and there's an import element, right? And how, this also. So it's not just about, VAT or import duty. Next, we are getting to the last slides. We have post-clearance on this, and this is the last two is where I wanted to emphasize. From the presentation from transfer pricing through to excise and others, we are seeing, integration of what used to be just transfer pricing. Once you go to BEPS and you go to banking reporting requirements, and others, we are seeing customs, the traditional form of customs not being just about revenue and checking smuggling, previously with a few illicits, but now international protocols are coming into play, and we are signing them as countries at a high level, but their effectiveness and benefit to us will come from the information that we store. If we sign multilateral agreements, we may end up being given information from the advanced countries, emerging countries, and saying, we think that this activity is taking place in your country, but do we have them in our databases so that we can also get the mutual benefits of what we have signed? Otherwise, we'll just be signing and it will just be, one way. So all I'm saying is for customs, in setting up our systems now and in taking over border controls, to have a larger picture, but that larger picture should not remain within customs, because when you need evidence for transfer pricing, for prosecution of illicit movement, to enforce, and as we say, you can earn your income, it can be illegal, but you have to do what? Pay the tax on it. And the illegality is sitting, for the assessment, is sitting in the customs database, or it's not even present, at all. Okay, so poor integration and interface, absence of useful information, absence of critical modules, right? The core system, and as I said, modules. And I think that some of the work that is being done by private sector, we can probably begin to think about how we can bring them on board, the presentations that were made, to begin to create databases and modules and things that would complement, the core systems, so that we can improve coordination, both domestically and internationally. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. I thought that was really a very good example of how people work. They tend to work in silos in their different areas, whereas in fact, if you can share information, you actually get a better result all round. I realise everyone's been sitting here for quite a long time, and I'm afraid I had to ask Seth to do this because I know he's needed in the other session that's concurrently. I think he will be around for the rest of the day, Seth, if people have questions and want to talk to you. But I think we should now break for coffee or tea and come back in half an hour, and then we can have some questions and discussion. So thank you very much.